Have you ever had that peculiar sensation, often in the most ordinary moments, that something about reality itself feels almost too convenient, too structured, too meticulously crafted? You might be driving along a familiar road, watching the seamless flow of traffic, or standing in line at a store observing the ritualistic exchange of currency for goods, when suddenly you feel a sort of cognitive vertigo, a momentary slippage in the fabric of what you've accepted as real. This isn't merely a philosophical abstraction. It manifests as a bodily sensation, a feeling in your gut that what surrounds you, what you've been taught to call reality, might be nothing more than an elaborate construction, a consensus hallucination that we've all agreed to participate in, without ever consciously making that choice. That feeling, that momentary breach in the continuity of what we call normal, is not a malfunction in your perception. It's actually a glimpse behind the curtain, a momentary clarity in which you perceive that the emperor of consensus reality has no clothes. These moments tend to come unbidden, often when we least expect them. Perhaps you've experienced it while gazing at your own reflection in a mirror, suddenly struck by the strangeness of having a body, of being confined within this particular form, with its specific limitations and capabilities. Or maybe it happened in the midst of a conversation, when you became hyper-aware of the arbitrary nature of language itself, the strange magic by which certain sounds and symbols have come to represent concepts, feelings, entire worldviews. These fractures in our ordinary perception are typically brief. The mind, uncomfortable with such fundamental uncertainty, quickly papers over them with explanations, distractions, or simply by redirecting attention back to the familiar currents of habitual thought. But for those who are willing to linger in these openings, to resist the automatic return to cognitive business as usual, these moments can become portals to a radically different understanding of the nature of existence itself. The ancient Vedic tradition spoke of Maya, the cosmic illusion, not as some distant metaphysical concept, but as the very substance of our daily experience. The Buddhists referred to samsara, the cycle of suffering perpetuated by our attachment to forms we believe to be solid and permanent. Even our modern physicists tell us that what appears as solid matter is mostly empty space, that particles can exist simultaneously in multiple states, that observation itself changes the thing observed. These are not merely interesting factoids to be collected and recited at intellectual gatherings. They are signposts pointing toward a fundamental truth about the nature of existence that most humans spend their entire lives desperately avoiding. We are living within a construction, a magnificently detailed simulation that we mistake for the totality of what is. And the most powerful aspect of this illusion is not that it exists, but that it convinces us so thoroughly that it is the only reality possible. The Hindu concept of Lila takes this understanding even further, suggesting that reality is a divine play, a cosmic game in which consciousness delights in forgetting itself in order to experience the joy of remembering. The Sufis speak of the 70,000 veils that separate us from reality, as it truly is. The Gnostic traditions warned of the archons, the forces that maintain our imprisonment in a false reality. The Taoist concept of the uncarved block points to a state of being prior to the conceptual divisions we impose upon experience. In tribe after tribe, culture after culture, we find these whispers of a truth that our modern industrial society has all but forgotten. When we dismiss these traditions as primitive superstition, we reveal not our sophistication, but our ignorance of the subtle dimensions of consciousness that our ancestors, in their deeper relationship with the rhythms of nature and the silence of contemplation, were able to access directly. The quantum physics discoveries of non-locality, wave-particle duality, and the uncertainty principle aren't simply abstract mathematical formulations relevant only to subatomic scales. They are scientific confirmations of what the perennial wisdom traditions have been telling us for millennia about the nature of reality. The solid, objective, material world that classical Newtonian physics described so convincingly is now understood, even by the most hard-headed scientists, to be at best an approximation, a useful model, rather than an absolute truth. Consider the caterpillar in its cocoon. If you were to somehow communicate with this creature during its transformation, it would have no conceptual framework to understand what it was becoming. The very notion of flight would be incomprehensible to an organism that has known only crawling. The caterpillar's reality Its entire understanding of existence is bounded by the limitations of its form and experience, yet within it lies the potential for a radically different mode of being. The butterfly doesn't represent an improvement of the caterpillar. It represents a fundamental transformation so complete that the two forms of existence can hardly be reconciled. This metamorphosis is not simply a biological process, but a perfect metaphor for what happens when human consciousness begins to awaken from the consensus trance, when the illusion of reality begins to reveal itself, not as a disappointment, but as an opportunity for unprecedented freedom. What's most fascinating about this transformation is that inside the chrysalis, the caterpillar doesn't gradually grow wings or develop the features of a butterfly in a linear fashion. Instead, it undergoes a process called histolysis, wherein it liquefies almost completely, dissolving into a primordial soup from which the butterfly will eventually emerge. The caterpillar must surrender entirely to this process of dissolution. There is no halfway point where it is partly caterpillar and partly butterfly. The old form must be thoroughly relinquished before the new form can manifest. This is precisely what happens in genuine spiritual transformation. The structures of identity, belief, and perception that have defined your reality must dissolve before a new way of being can emerge. This is why authentic awakening often feels like a kind of death. The sense of self that has navigated your life thus far, the I that you've taken yourself to be, must surrender to a process that it cannot control or even comprehend from within its current framework. And just as the caterpillar has encoded within it the informational blueprint for becoming a butterfly, the human psyche contains the potential for its own metamorphosis, for a way of being that transcends the limitations of our current mode of consciousness, while simultaneously fulfilling its ultimate purpose. The challenge we face is that awakening from this illusion is not merely an intellectual exercise. It's not about accumulating esoteric knowledge or performing the right spiritual practices. These can become just another layer of the dream, a spiritual materialism that reinforces the very structures it claims to transcend. No, true awakening involves a kind of existential vertigo, a period where the ground beneath your feet seems to dissolve, where everything you believe to be stable and reliable begins to reveal itself as provisional, constructed, agreed upon, rather than inherent. This is why genuine spiritual awakening is often preceded by crisis. The solid structures of identity and reality must crack before the light can enter. The caterpillar must surrender to the dissolution of its form before the butterfly can emerge. What we call the spiritual path might more accurately be described as a process of successive disillusionments. Each step involves the recognition and relinquishment of something we had mistaken for ultimate truth or solid ground. We discover that our most cherished beliefs, our sense of identity, even our direct perceptions are all conditioned, all constructed through layers of interpretation that we have internalized so deeply that they operate below the threshold of awareness. We have been taught how to see, how to think, how to feel, and these teachings have become so thoroughly embedded in our experience that we mistake them for reality itself. When these layers begin to become visible, when we start to recognize the extent to which our experience is mediated by concepts, beliefs, and linguistic structures that we did not choose but simply absorbed from our culture, a profound disorientation can occur. The philosopher Peter Kingsley describes this as the moment when everything you believe to be knowledge reveals itself as ignorance, when everything you thought was light reveals itself as darkness. This is not a pleasant experience. It is a necessary dissolution, a confrontation with the extent of our conditioning that can leave us feeling groundless, adrift in a sea of uncertainty, with no familiar landmarks to orient by. And here lies the genuine danger of waking up, the risk that few spiritual teachers have the courage to articulate clearly. As you begin to perceive the constructed nature of consensus reality, you also begin to recognize how deeply invested everyone around you is in maintaining that construction. Your awakening threatens the collective dream, not because you become evangelistic about your insights, but because your very presence, your way of moving through the world with different values and perceptions, creates a kind of cognitive dissonance in others. They can sense, often unconsciously, that you are no longer fully participating in the game, and this activates a powerful immune response in the social organism designed to either pull you back into conformity or isolate you as a potential threat. Throughout history, those who have glimpsed beyond the veil and returned to speak of what they saw have faced exile, persecution, ridicule, or worse. From Socrates being sentenced to death for corrupting the youth with dangerous questions to modern whistleblowers being ostracized for revealing uncomfortable truths, the pattern is clear. The collective has powerful mechanisms for enforcing consensus and neutralizing perceived threats to its stability. When you begin to awaken, you become such a threat. not because you intend any harm, but because your existence as an awakened being implicitly calls into question the validity of the collective dream. Your capacity to live according to different values, to organize your attention around different priorities, to derive meaning and fulfillment from sources beyond the socially sanctioned channels of consumption, achievement, and status, demonstrates that the normative reality is not the only option, and this demonstration, however subtle, however non-confrontational you might try to be, inherently destabilizes the foundations of consensus reality for those who encounter you. The collective unconsciously recognizes this danger and responds accordingly, often not with direct opposition, but with 1,000 subtle forms of invalidation, marginalization, and pressure to return to conformity. This is the crucible in which genuine awakening is either extinguished or tempered into something durable enough to withstand these pressures. I want to pause for a moment and ask you directly, when was the moment you realized you were perceiving reality differently than those around you? That instant when you felt you had crossed an invisible boundary, and suddenly the everyday conversations, the mundane concerns, the values that everyone takes for granted, began to seem like elaborate props in a theatrical production in which you could no longer participate with the same conviction. I know this experience can be profoundly lonely. You look at your friends, your family, your colleagues, and realize you're seeing layers of reality that they simply don't perceive. And the most difficult part isn't their incomprehension, but the silence you must maintain to avoid being judged, labeled, or worse yet, to prevent them from feeling inadequate or threatened by your transformation. I want you to know that your experience matters, that your journey, even when solitary, is creating ripples in the field of consciousness that affect everyone around you, even if in imperceptible ways. And that's why I'd like to invite you to share a fragment of your experience in the comments below. You can simply copy this phrase and complete it. I realized I was awakening when Trostiar. By doing this, you not only validate your own experience, but you also extend a hand to someone else who might be watching this video feeling like they're the only one in the world going through this. Your comment might be exactly the confirmation someone needs to continue on their journey, to know they're not going crazy, that they're not alone. This silent community of awakened people spread throughout the world strengthens every time we recognize each other, like distant lights in the darkness, which when seen together form a constellation of expanded consciousness. Now, let's continue our exploration of what happens when you begin to perceive the illusory nature of what we call reality. The initial recognition that the solid world might be more like a collective dream often brings with it a sense of existential terror. If nothing is as it seems, if the very fabric of reality is a construction rather than an objective truth, then what can we trust? What remains solid when the ground beneath us begins to shift? This terror is not a sign that you're doing something wrong or that you should retreat back into the comfort of unexamined assumptions. It is a necessary passage, the dark night that precedes a more expansive dawn. The butterfly emerging from its chrysalis must struggle against the very structures that once protected it. This struggle is not punishment, but the necessary pressure that strengthens its wings for flight. What makes this process particularly challenging in our modern context is that we live in a culture that pathologizes non-ordinary states of consciousness. If you begin to question the fundamental nature of reality, if you report experiences that don't fit within the materialist paradigm, you risk being labeled, medicated, marginalized. The medical model of psychiatry has no category for spiritual emergency, for the perfectly natural crisis that accompanies the dissolution of an outdated worldview. And so, many who begin to awaken retreat back into conformity out of fear, or find themselves isolated, unable to communicate the profound shifts occurring within them. This is the danger of waking up in a sleeping world. The majority has agreed upon the parameters of what constitutes sanity, and those parameters are suspiciously aligned with what maintains the economic and social status quo. We inhabit a culture that has so thoroughly externalized its attention, so completely invested in the material dimension of existence, that it has lost the vocabulary, the conceptual framework, and the social structures needed to support the inner journey of awakening. Indigenous cultures typically recognized the signs of spiritual emergence and had elders, rituals, and wisdom traditions to guide individuals through these transformative passages. But in our post-industrial, hyper-rational society, these resources have been systematically dismantled, pathologized, or commodified into shallow, commercialized approximations of genuine wisdom traditions. The individual in spiritual crisis is left adrift, often diagnosing themselves through internet searches or self-help books, piecing together an understanding of their experience without the benefit of wise elders who have traversed this territory before them. The very language we use to describe these experiences has been co-opted by psychiatric discourse, which frames them as dissociative states, derealization, grandiose delusions, or other pathological conditions to be treated and eliminated, rather than potentially meaningful transitions to be supported and integrated. This pathologization serves a social function beyond the individual cases it purports to address. It maintains the boundaries of consensus reality by establishing clear penalties for straying beyond them. The message is clear: question the nature of reality too persistently, experience consciousness too differently from the norm, and you will be classified as mentally ill, with all the social, professional, and personal consequences that entails. This implicit threat keeps many on the verge of awakening safely contained within the parameters of acceptable perception and inquiry. Consider also that as you awaken to the constructed nature of reality, you simultaneously awaken to your role in that construction. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of the journey. It's far easier to recognize the illusions that others are participating in than to confront our own continuous creation of and participation in those very illusions. We want to position ourselves outside the matrix, as enlightened observers who have transcended the collective dream. But this stance itself becomes another subtle form of ego identification, another layer of illusion. True awakening isn't about escaping the matrix. It's about recognizing your integral role within it, your moment-to-moment participation in the creation of what appears as reality. This recognition leads to one of the central paradoxes of spiritual awakening: the illusion is real. By this I mean that the dream-like nature of consensus reality doesn't make it any less consequential or meaningful. The pain, joy, struggle, and beauty experienced within this construction have a validity and significance that isn't diminished by recognizing their constructed nature. The awakened perspective isn't about invalidating the reality in which we find ourselves, but about expanding our relationship with it, recognizing both its dreamlike nature and its profound consequences simultaneously. This is the meaning of the Buddhist concept of emptiness, which is often misunderstood in Western interpretations. Emptiness doesn't mean that nothing exists or that everything is meaningless. It means that nothing exists in the solid, independent, unchanging way that our conventional perception suggests. Everything is empty of inherent existence precisely because everything is interdependent, in continuous flux, and co-constructed through relationship. Consider the phenomenon we call a rainbow. The rainbow exists as a perceptual experience, yet it has no location that we can pinpoint. It forms through the interaction of light, water droplets, and the specific position of the observer. Change any of these elements, and the rainbow either changes or disappears entirely. Is the rainbow real? Yes and no. It's a genuine perceptual experience, yet it lacks independent existence. It emerges through relationship, through the dance of multiple factors coming together in a particular configuration. This rainbow-like nature of all phenomena becomes apparent through the awakening process. We recognize that what we have taken to be solid, separate objects, including our own sense of self, are more accurately understood as processes, as patterns of relationship unfolding in time, as convergences of countless conditions that have no independent existence apart from their momentary constellation. This understanding doesn't negate the reality of experience, but it transforms our relationship with it. The tree outside your window doesn't disappear when you recognize its rainbow-like nature, but your perception of it, your felt relationship with it, may shift profoundly. You begin to perceive not just its material form, but the intricate web of relationships that constitute its existence, its continuous exchange with soil, air, sunlight, its participation in vast ecological and evolutionary processes, its unique expression of an intelligence that pervades all of life. The tree becomes simultaneously more real and less solid, more significant and less separate, more precious and less possessible. Another paradox emerges as you move deeper into the awakening process. The more clearly you perceive the constructed nature of reality, the more responsibility you must assume for your participation in that construction. Freedom and responsibility are not opposed, but intimately linked. The recognition that reality is more malleable, more responsive to consciousness than we have been led to believe, doesn't absolve us from ethical considerations. It intensifies them. If your thoughts, beliefs, and actions are actively participating in the creation of what appears as reality, then the imperative to cultivate clarity, compassion, and wisdom becomes not just a personal preference, but an ecological necessity. Your consciousness is not separate from the field of consciousness in which we are all embedded. Your awakening, or your continued sleepwalking, affects the whole in ways we are only beginning to comprehend. This brings us to perhaps the most challenging aspect of awakening from the illusion of reality, the loneliness that accompanies seeing differently. Human beings are tribal creatures. We have evolved to seek consensus, to align our perceptions and beliefs with the group as a survival strategy. When you begin to perceive reality differently than those around you, you risk losing something deeply primal, the sense of unquestioned belonging within your social group. This is not a trivial concern. The pain of isolation can be more difficult to bear than physical pain, and many who begin to awaken retreat back into conformity, not because they don't trust their own perceptions, but because the alternative seems to be an unbearable solitude. I want to acknowledge the full weight of this challenge. The path of awakening is not for the faint of heart. It requires a willingness to stand alone, at least for a time, to trust your own experience even when it contradicts what everyone around you accepts as true. It requires the courage to live with questions rather than false certainties, to hold paradox rather than retreat into dogma. It asks you to develop an intimate relationship with uncertainty, to recognize that the ground of being itself may be more like a creative process than a solid foundation. This is not a path for those seeking comfort or easy answers. It's a path for those who sense that there is something more to existence than what the dominant paradigm acknowledges, who feel called to explore the further reaches of human consciousness, not out of spiritual materialism but out of an authentic longing for truth. Yet here is where we find the opportunity within the danger of awakening. The very solitude that seems so threatening can become the space in which a more authentic form of connection becomes possible. When you are no longer seeking validation for your worldview, when you are no longer trying to convince others or be convinced, when you can allow each person their own journey at their own pace, a different quality of relationship can emerge. This relationship is not based on shared illusions, but on mutual respect for the mystery of existence, for the unique expression of consciousness that each being represents. This is the foundation for community among the awakened, not a rigid consensus about what is real, but a shared commitment to presence, authenticity, and compassion within the unfolding dream of existence. The practical wisdom that emerges from this perspective is not a set of rules or techniques, but an orientation toward existence itself. It begins with radical honesty about your own experience, a willingness to notice without judgment when you are retreating into familiar patterns of perception, to avoid the discomfort of the unknown. It involves cultivating a relationship with uncertainty that is not anxious but curious, not desperate for resolution, but comfortable with emergence. It requires developing discernment about which structures in your life are serving consciousness and which are limiting it, which beliefs are expansive and which are constrictive. And perhaps most importantly, it asks you to hold your own awakening lightly, to avoid the trap of spiritual inflation where the ego co-opts the insights of awakening to create a new, more sophisticated form of self-importance. There is a quality of humility that accompanies genuine awakening, not because you know less than others, but because you have touched the edge of the unknowable and recognized how vast it is. The truly awakened person doesn't claim special status or demand recognition for their attainment. They move through the world with an ordinary extraordinariness, fully engaged with the tangible reality before them, while simultaneously aware of its dreamlike nature. They have not transcended humanity but fully embodied it, embracing both the limitations of form and the limitlessness of consciousness. This is the integration that follows the crisis of awakening, the butterfly that not only emerges from the chrysalis, but learns to navigate both the earth and sky with equal grace. What lies beyond the illusion is not another, more perfect reality, where everything makes sense and all suffering is eliminated. What lies beyond is this very same existence but perceived with new eyes, experienced with a heart that has been broken open by the recognition of both the beauty and impermanence of all forms. The awakened state is not an escape from the world, but a full immersion in it, not a transcendence of human experience, but a complete embrace of it. The illusion falls away not to reveal something else, but to reveal what has always been here, hidden in plain sight, obscured only by our preconceptions, our learned habits of perception, our fear of the vastness that we are. The Zen tradition points to this with the saying, "Before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water." The outward activities may appear unchanged, but the internal relationship to those activities, the quality of presence brought to them, the understanding of their significance within the greater pattern of existence, is utterly transformed. This is why those who have genuinely awakened rarely appear special or extraordinary in conventional terms. They don't levitate or perform miracles or speak exclusively in cryptic koans. They simply live with uncommon presence, authenticity, and compassion, qualities that our hurried, distracted society may not even recognize as significant. The awakened being doesn't stand apart from the world in some rarefied spiritual state, but participates more fully in it, more intimately engaged with the texture of existence, more responsive to the actuality of what is, rather than projections of what should be. They have not transcended humanity, but embodied it more completely, embracing the fullness of human experience, without the distortions of egoic identification, without the filters of unexamined beliefs and assumptions, without the burden of maintaining an image of themselves to present to the world. This is freedom, not from the conditions of existence, but from the unnecessary suffering created by our relationship with those conditions. And it is available not after years of arduous spiritual practice, not as a reward for perfect moral behavior, not as an exclusive state reserved for special individuals, but as the natural unfolding of consciousness when the obstacles to its recognition are brought into awareness and allowed to dissolve in the light of that very awareness itself. Trust the process. Trust your unique journey of awakening even when it leads through territories that none of your spiritual books or teachers have mapped. Trust the intelligence of life itself as it moves through you, dismantling what no longer serves, creating space for new possibilities of being and relating. The butterfly doesn't need to be taught how to fly. The wisdom of flight is encoded within its transformation. In the same way, the wisdom of how to live from an awakened perspective emerges naturally as you allow the process to unfold within you, as you remain honest about your experience without trying to force it into pre-existing frameworks of understanding. If these reflections on the illusion of reality and the challenges of awakening have touched something within you, know that you are not alone on this journey. This path of consciousness expansion can seem isolating when those around you don't understand the transformations you're experiencing. It's precisely for this reason that we've created this safe space, this refuge for seekers like you. By subscribing to the channel, you become part of a silent community of people who, like you, are navigating between two worlds, the conventional and the expansive. Each new video we share is like a beacon in the fog, illuminating a bit more of the path ahead, offering new perspectives on how to integrate your awakened perceptions into everyday life without losing your authenticity. We're not here to offer easy answers or empty promises of instant enlightenment. We're here to walk together, to explore the mysteries of consciousness with honesty and depth, to validate your experience when the world around you cannot understand it. If you feel you're perceiving realities that go unnoticed by most, if you sense that the illusion is both real and transcendable, this channel is your sanctuary. Subscribe and allow yourself to be nourished by reflections that recognize both the beauty and the challenge of your awakening. Together, we form an invisible web of expanding consciousnesses, each at our own pace, but connected by authentic seeking. A simple click on the subscription button is a silent whisper that says, "I too am on this path. I too am awakening." And that, in a world that often makes us feel alienated in our own expanded perception, is an invaluable treasure.